My son-in-law sent the message at 6:14 on a Saturday evening, 3 days before Christmas. I was in my kitchen making tea when my phone lit up on the counter. I assumed it was something about pickup times, or whether I should bring anything. Instead, I read, "Dad, we've decided Christmas this year is going to be intimate. Just our immediate family. We hope you understand." My daughter had added below it, "We just need our own space this year. Love you." Then my son-in-law again. A second message that arrived before I'd even finished reading the first. "You've been incredibly generous. We can handle things from here. Merry Christmas." I set my mug down, read it again, then a third time, immediate family. I was her father. I had held her in a hospital in Kelowna 63 years ago while her mother recovered in the next room. I had coached her soccer team when she was 9. I had sat beside her at her mother's funeral 3 years ago and told her everything would be all right, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. And now I was being informed, via a group chat that also included my son-in-law's brother and his wife, that I hadn't made the cut for immediate family. I picked up the phone, typed one sentence into the chat. "Understood. I'll start with the mortgage payment first." Then I left the group. 43 minutes later, I had 78 missed calls. I want to explain something about myself before I explain what happened next. Because context matters, and I've spent 40 years as a project manager understanding that you cannot evaluate a decision without understanding the conditions that produced it. My wife and I moved to Kelowna in 1998 when the valley was still affordable and the tech sector hadn't yet discovered it. I worked for a civil engineering firm, then eventually went independent as a project consultant. My wife taught elementary school. We weren't wealthy by any measure, but we were careful. We paid off our mortgage on our primary home by 2011. We saved. We put money into RRSPs every year without fail because that was what responsible people did, and we were, above most things, responsible people. She was diagnosed in the winter of 2021. By the spring of 2022, it was clear the diagnosis was a sentence and not a warning. She died in October of that year on a Tuesday morning, while I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand and failing, completely, to think of a single, adequate thing to say. My daughter and her husband came back to Kelowna from Vancouver for the funeral and stayed for 2 weeks. On the last evening before they flew home, my son-in-law mentioned, almost casually, over dinner, that their lease in Vancouver was ending. Rents had become impossible. He was looking at remote work options. They'd been thinking about getting out of the city anyway. And of course, with everything I'd just been through, maybe it made sense for everyone if they were closer. I had a property on the north end of the city, a house I'd purchased in 2019, initially as an investment, a 3-bedroom rancher with a double garage and a view of the hills. It had been renting until the tenants moved out in August of that year, and I hadn't relisted it because I hadn't had the energy for anything during those final months with my wife. I offered it to my daughter and her husband as a place to get settled. Temporarily, we all agreed. Just until they found their footing. That was 4 years ago. In those 4 years, I had paid the mortgage on the property, $2,840 a month, because I had refinanced it in 2020 for renovation costs. I had paid the lease on my son-in-law's truck, $780 monthly for a Ford F. $150, he'd insisted, was necessary for the contracting work he sometimes picked up. I had paid the lease on my daughter's CRV, $620. I had covered the private school tuition for both grandchildren at a school my son-in-law had selected, because the public option in their catchment wasn't good enough. $1,400 per month. Utilities, $600. Extended health and dental benefits, because my son-in-law's new remote position didn't include a benefits package, and my daughter had gone part-time after the second child. $480. Irregular contributions to their grocery budget, which my daughter had framed as temporary, and my son-in-law had quietly made permanent by texting me e-transfer requests without explanation most weeks. I sat down that night at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I did the math. Not because I didn't already know the number, roughly, but because I needed to see it written in my own handwriting. $7,140 every month. Canadian dollars, not American. For 4 years, the number sat on the page and I looked at it for a long time. Outside my condo window, the lights from houses across Okanagan Lake reflected across the black water in long, broken lines. It was December in Kelowna, cold and dry, the way the valley gets when the mountain air comes down without the moderation of summer heat. I had chosen this condo after my wife died because the view reminded me of a trip we'd taken to Italy years ago, the way the lights sat on water in the evening, and because a 2-bedroom condo was the right size for one person who didn't need to accommodate anyone else's vision of family. I opened my banking app, found the recurring payments section, and looked at each line the way you look at something you've been averting your eyes from for years. The amounts were precise and familiar. I had set them up myself, methodically, in the weeks after my daughter moved in, because I was someone who believed in doing things properly rather than awkwardly. Cash transfers and vague conversations weren't how I operated. Clean automatic payments, clean records, clean arrangements. I began at the top of the list and worked my way down. Mortgage, canceled. Car lease, F-150, canceled. Car lease, CRV, canceled. Private school tuition, canceled. Utilities autopay, canceled. Extended health plan, canceled. Each one took between 3 and 6 minutes. Security questions, confirmation dialogues, the particular bureaucratic patience required by online banking systems, designed to discourage exactly what I was doing. I worked through them without rushing. I had nowhere to be. By the time I reached the last item, a standing grocery e-transfer authorization I had set up 6 months ago, when the requests had become frequent enough to warrant it, my phone had vibrated itself across the table 3 times from the sheer volume of incoming calls. I hadn't looked at it once. I finished, closed the app, and made myself a proper scotch from the bottle I kept for company, sat by the window, and watched the lake. Eventually, I picked up the phone. 78 missed calls. 19 voicemails I didn't listen to. 44 text messages I didn't read. I set it face down and went to bed. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I had worked with enough contractors and subcontractors over 40 years to understand the value of choosing professionals carefully and trusting them completely once chosen. I spent 45 minutes on a Sunday morning reviewing Kelowna area real estate and tenancy lawyers before I found the one I wanted. A woman named Patricia Kowalczyk, who had 15 years of experience in BC property law and whose client reviews described her as precise, unsentimental, and effective. I left a message with her answering service, requesting the earliest available appointment. She called back Monday morning at 8:15. I explained the situation without embellishment. Property in my name. 4 years of occupancy with no formal lease, no rent paid, no written agreement of any kind. She asked me to send over the property title, my bank records, showing payment history, and any written communications. I forwarded everything before lunch. We met in her office on Wednesday. She was exactly what the reviews had suggested, a woman who listened without expression, asked precise questions, and did not editorialize about the personal dimensions of the situation. She reviewed the documents I had brought in a manila envelope. Title: my name only. No co-signers, no encumbrances, no rental agreements on file. She looked up after 15 minutes and told me what I already suspected. My position was unambiguous. Under BC tenancy law, I was entitled to issue a 2-month notice to vacate. She could have the formal notice drafted and sent via registered mail within 48 hours. I asked about the vehicles. She confirmed what I had assumed. Both leases were in my name. I could terminate them according to the contract terms, with 7 days written notice to the leasing companies. The vehicles would be retrieved by the lessors. I wrote her a retainer check for $4,000 before I left. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch Thursday with the draft notice. On Thursday evening, my daughter appeared at my condo building. I know because the lobby camera alert came through on my phone at 7:22 while I was reading. She was alone, which surprised me. She stood in the lobby for several minutes, spoke to the concierge, was told she could not go up without my authorization. I watched on the camera feed. She looked tired and genuinely upset, which was different from angry. I felt the difference, and it cost me something to acknowledge it. I called down to the concierge and asked him to let her know I wasn't available and would reach out when I was ready to talk. He relayed the message. She stood there for another minute, then left. My son-in-law did not come himself. He sent my daughter instead. I filed that observation away. Friday, Patricia sent me the draft notice. I reviewed it carefully, made one minor correction to a property description, and confirmed she should proceed. She sent it via registered mail and courier, with confirmation of delivery expected by Monday. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday reviewing some financial planning I had been putting off, including updating my RRSP contribution room calculations and reviewing my investment portfolio. The absence of $7,000 in monthly outgoing payments was visible immediately in my projected cash flow. I ran the numbers forward 10 years. The difference was substantial enough that I sat with it for a while. Not with satisfaction exactly, more with the particular discomfort of understanding how much I had simply not allowed myself to see. Sunday morning, I was having coffee when my phone rang. A number I recognized as my son-in-law's mother. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief and pointed. She'd heard what I'd done. She thought it was cruel, and she hoped I'd reconsider before I destroyed my family. She said my wife would be heartbroken. I played it back once, then deleted it. My wife had understood people with unusual clarity. It was one of the things I had loved most about her. She had said once, not long before she got sick, that she worried my daughter had married someone who believed that generosity was a debt owed rather than a gift given. She hadn't said it with anger. She'd said it the way she said most difficult things. Carefully, as if she was still deciding whether it was true. I had told her she was being too hard on him. She had nodded and let it go. The way she let go of things she knew she was right about but didn't want to argue over. She was right. I had just needed 4 more years to see it. The notice was delivered Monday morning. My son-in-law signed for it. Patricia texted me the confirmation. I forwarded her email to a dedicated folder I had created on my laptop. Property, December 2024. At 11:47 that morning, my office phone rang. I looked at the number, which I recognized as coming from my son-in-law's personal cell, and let my assistant take a message. She came in 5 minutes later, looking slightly flustered, and told me a man had called, identified himself as my son-in-law, become quite agitated when told I was unavailable, and asked that I call him back urgently regarding something involving my grandchildren. I thanked her and went back to the site review I had open on my screen. He called again at 2. I didn't answer. At 3:30, a text arrived from my daughter's number. "Dad, please. The kids are scared. Can we please just talk?" I read it, put the phone in my desk drawer, and finished the afternoon. That evening I drove to the grocery store, made dinner, watched the news. The familiar rhythms of a person who has learned to find adequacy in their own company. On Thursday of that week, a notification came through from my daughter's Facebook account. We were still connected there, which I hadn't thought to address. She had posted publicly, "My father is evicting us with 2 months' notice, 3 days after Christmas. My children are 9 and 7. We have nowhere to go. I never believed family could do something like this." 2 photographs attached. One of the notice document, portions of it photographed and partially visible, and one of my grandchildren sitting on the living room floor looking subdued. By the time I saw it that evening, it had 81 comments and 47 shares. I sat with it longer than I expected to, not because it moved me toward reconsidering, but because I was trying to measure my own response clearly. The post was calculated. The photographs of the children were calculated. The timing, 3 days after Christmas, was calculated for maximum sympathetic framing. My son-in-law's fingerprints were on the strategy, even if my daughter's name was on the account. I texted 2 colleagues I had known for more than 20 years. Attached the screenshots of the group chat messages from December 22nd, my son-in-law's texts, my daughter's addition, the declaration that I wasn't immediate family. Kept my message to 1 sentence. This is what prompted the decision. Thought you should have the context. Sent. Closed my phone. I did not post anything publicly. I did not respond to the Facebook post. I did not contact my daughter to discuss it. I contacted Patricia and told her about the post. She advised me to document everything and take no public action. Public disputes, she said, almost always benefited the person with less to lose. And that wasn't me. The following week, I sent the lease termination letters to Toyota Financial Services and Ford Credit Canada per the contract terms. Both vehicles would be retrieved within 7 days of notification. Patricia handled the formal correspondence. I simply signed where indicated. My son-in-law's truck was collected on a Friday morning. I had installed a security camera on the property the previous November, an owner's right in BC with proper notice to occupants, which I had given in writing. I watched the footage that evening. The repossession driver was professional and efficient. My son-in-law stood in the driveway and argued for several minutes. My daughter appeared in the doorway and watched without intervening. Eventually, my son-in-law went back inside. The truck disappeared around the corner. My daughter's CRV was collected the following Monday. She was not home. The vehicle was simply gone when she returned from wherever she'd gone, which I know because she called me from a number I hadn't blocked, and I answered out of something that wasn't quite softness, more like a recognition that she was, underneath everything, still her mother's daughter. She cried. I let her. When she stopped, I said, as clearly and without anger as I could manage, I didn't exclude myself from your family. I was told I hadn't earned the right to be there. I responded accordingly. She said she hadn't meant it. I told her I understood that. But her husband had, and she had let him. And there was a difference between being controlled and being complicit. But from where I sat, the result looked the same. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at the dark window, and then I made dinner. January brought a RCMP call. A constable from the local detachment, explaining that a complaint had been filed alleging financial exploitation of a family member. He was professional, apologetic in the way that Canadian police are when they've clearly already assessed the situation and are making the call out of process rather than belief. I gave him Patricia's number. She had everything organized and available within a day. The constable called back 48 hours later to say no investigation would be proceeding and thanked me for my time. Patricia told me that filing a false complaint with the RCMP was a significant strategic error. Whatever neutral observers had remained were now in a position to evaluate who was behaving reasonably and who was not. I told her I simply wanted it resolved and filed away. She agreed that was the right approach. February arrived, cold and clear. I called a real estate agent I had used before, a man named David Aubin, who specialized in Kelowna residential properties and who had helped me purchase the North End house in 2019. I told him I was ready to list. He came by the property after the move-out, which had happened in the last week of January, quiet and exhausted looking from what I could see on the security feed, boxes loaded into a rented truck, without any of the confrontation that had characterized earlier weeks. They had apparently concluded that drama was no longer productive. David walked through the property with his notepad and his camera and his professional cheerfulness. He told me the market had recovered from the corrections of 2023 and that a well-maintained 3-bedroom in this location was going to attract serious interest. We listed at $920,000. The offer came in 11 days later, a couple relocating from Calgary, all cash, closing in 30 days. We accepted at $905,000. After the agent's commission and associated closing costs, I cleared approximately $460,000 above the remaining mortgage balance. I sat with my financial advisor the following week and allocated it methodically. RRSP top-up to lifetime limit, TFSA contributions. The remainder into a balanced portfolio of dividend stocks and government bonds. Conservative choices, the kind that grew slowly and didn't require attention. I was 66 years old. I didn't need excitement from my money. I needed it to function reliably and not vanish. In early March, I received a letter. The envelope was addressed in handwriting that was too careful for an adult. Letters formed with the deliberate effort of someone who had been coached on how to make them look authentic. Flowers drawn along the top edge in red crayon. Inside, on lined paper, Dear Grandpa, we miss you. Please come back. Love, Emma and Liam. I held it in the kitchen for a long time. Then I took a photograph of it for the documentation folder, placed the original in the same folder, stood at my window and looked at the lake and spoke to no one. You didn't write that, Emma. I know what your handwriting looks like, but I'm sorry you were asked to try. My late wife's sister had called me in January, after seeing the Facebook post and doing what she described as some independent thinking. She was a practical woman who had never entirely warmed to my son-in-law, a feeling she had kept mostly to herself out of loyalty to my daughter. She drove from Vernon to Kelowna to sit in my kitchen and asked me to show her what had actually happened. I showed her. The chat messages, the bank records, the title documents. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My sister would have done the same thing, maybe faster." We had started meeting monthly for coffee. She told me in March that she had seen both grandchildren the previous weekend, that they were adjusting, that Emma had started at the new school and had already made a friend, that Liam had asked about me. I asked carefully whether there was any possibility of seeing them, not as a step toward anything involving my daughter or her husband, just on its own terms. She thought about it for a moment, and then said yes. I picked up a board game from the toy store downtown, Ticket to Ride, the Canada edition, because it seemed appropriate, and because the railway map would give us something to argue about productively. I drove to my sister-in-law's house in Vernon on a Saturday afternoon in late March, with the game under my arm and the particular anxiety of someone who doesn't know if they'll be welcomed. Emma answered the door. She looked at me the way children look at adults they're uncertain about, assessing from a safe distance. Liam was behind her, quieter, watching. We sat on the floor in the living room and I set up the board and explained the rules and we played for 2 hours. Emma was competitive in a way that reminded me of her grandmother. Liam got distracted by the train pieces and lined them up by color instead of placing them on routes, which I decided was a legitimate approach and said nothing about. Halfway through the game, Emma looked up at me and asked why I had stopped coming to her school concerts. I glanced at my sister-in-law, who gave me a small nod. "Things got complicated for a while," I said, "but I'm here now." She considered this with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old evaluating an adult explanation for reasonableness. Then she rolled the dice and placed her trains across Saskatchewan with considerable satisfaction. When I left that afternoon, Liam hugged my leg without being asked. Emma waved from the porch. I drove back to Kelowna on the highway along the lake with the Okanagan Hills brown and dry in the early spring light, and I didn't try to name what I was feeling. I just let it sit there. April brought news through my sister-in-law that my daughter and her husband had separated. She had moved with the children into a smaller rental in Penticton. He had moved somewhere else. I received this information without comment and did not follow up with questions. It wasn't information I had sought. It was simply what had happened when two people who had built their financial life on someone else's willingness to fund it discovered that the funding had stopped. By May, my monthly expenses had stabilized at a figure so much lower than the preceding 4 years that reviewing my account statements felt briefly surreal, like reading documents from someone else's life. The money I was no longer spending on my daughter's household sat in my accounts instead, compounding with the quiet reliability I had always found more satisfying than drama. I was at my office one afternoon reviewing quarterly projections when my phone rang. "My daughter's number," I answered. She sounded different, steadier. She said she wasn't calling to ask for anything, that she wanted to be clear about that up front, that she just needed to say she understood now, that she had let her husband manage things she should have paid attention to, that she had let him characterize my involvement in their lives as something other than what it was, that she was sorry. I listened. She didn't rush the silence when she finished. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I know that's not enough." I said, "No, but it's a start." We talked for 20 minutes, about the children, mostly, about the logistics of her situation in Penticton, about nothing consequential. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a while, looking at the middle distance. Then I opened the portfolio I'd been reviewing and went back to work. It was my sister-in-law who called a few weeks later to ask if I'd be willing to come to Emma's end-of-year school performance in Penticton. My daughter had asked her to pass along the invitation because she wasn't sure I'd answer if she called directly. I drove down on a Thursday evening in June. The The school was a low brick building with a gymnasium that smelled like every gymnasium I had ever been in. I sat 3 rows back and watched both grandchildren perform with a recorder ensemble that was enthusiastic in inverse proportion to its tuning accuracy, and I thought, despite myself, that it was one of the better evenings I could remember. After, in the parking lot, Emma found me before I reached my car. She grabbed my hand without preamble and led me back to where Liam was standing with my daughter, who looked at me the way adults look at each other when they have said the most important things and haven't yet worked out what comes after. We didn't resolve anything that evening. We just stood in a parking lot in Penticton while the kids told me about their recorders and the camping trip their class was planning and the injustice of bedtimes. Normal conversation, small and uncomplicated. I drove home along the lake in the midsummer evening, windows down, the valley smelling like dry grass and ponderosa pine, the way it does in July, and I thought about my wife the way I often did on long drives. The comfortable, ongoing presence she had remained in my thoughts. I thought she would have had something precise and accurate to say about all of it, about where things stood and what they meant. She usually did. What I thought she would say was, "You did what was necessary. Now see what's possible." On the last evening in August, I sat on my condo balcony with a glass of scotch and the remnant of the day's heat still rising off the concrete. The lake was flat and dark below. The lights of West Kelowna made a low string of reflections across the water. I pulled up the financial dashboard on my phone out of habit more than curiosity. The numbers were orderly and healthy in mine. 9 months since that December message. 9 months since I had been informed, in a group chat, that I had not earned the right to be considered immediate family. 9 months since I had replied with a single sentence and watched the phone light up for an hour without answering it. I thought briefly about my son-in-law, wherever he was, and felt nothing I would describe as satisfaction. What I felt was closer to what you feel when a long-standing structural problem has finally been correctly addressed. Not triumph, resolution. My daughter was rebuilding something without the architecture of dependency that had defined the previous 4 years. That would either produce something better or it wouldn't. It was her work to do, not mine. Emma and Liam would remember a year their lives changed shape suddenly. They would build their own interpretations of it over time. I hoped mine included the board game on the floor in Vernon and the parking lot in Penticton and whatever came after, if anything came after. Children were more adaptable than adults gave them credit for, which was something adults said to comfort themselves, but which also happened to be true. A text arrived from my sister-in-law, a photograph of Emma and Liam from that afternoon, both of them grinning at something outside the camera's frame. She'd added one line below. They asked about next weekend. I looked at the photograph for a moment. Then I typed back, "Tell them I'll be there." The lake sat still below the balcony. The mountains on the far side were dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky. Some years ago, I would have sat here and found the solitude empty in the way that loss makes things empty. I didn't find it empty anymore. I had filled it with what was actually mine. My own days, my own decisions, my own company when company was what I had, and other people's company when that was what the evening offered instead. I had given away more than money in those 4 years. I had given away the time and the attention and the quiet self-respect that came from being treated as though your presence in someone's life was something other than a convenience. Getting it back had cost me things I didn't take lightly. Estrangement and uncomfortable evenings, and a daughter's crying voice on a telephone, and a photograph of a child's too careful handwriting. Small prices, perhaps. Or not small, but honest, which was something the preceding years had not always been. I finished the scotch. The city went on below me in its ordinary way, indifferent to small reckonings and private peace. I picked up the board game catalog I'd been reading before I came out and found my page and read until the evening cooled enough to go inside. Whatever came next would be on terms I had chosen. That was enough.